Chapter 1. The Silent Chimes. Miss Jane Marple was just putting the finishing touches to her hat, a modest affair of black felt with a small bunch of violets, when she first noticed the silence. For a moment, she couldn't place what was missing from this particular Sunday morning. Then it struck her. The bells of St. Mary Mead, which had rung faithfully for centuries, summoning the villagers to worship with their melodious chimes, were silent. She glanced at the small carriage clock on her mantelpiece. 10:15. Most certainly the bells should have been ringing by now. They always began at 9:30, giving the good people of St. Mary Mead ample time to don their Sunday best and make their way to the church. Most peculiar, murmured Miss Marple to herself. In her experience, and Miss Marple had a great deal of experience with the peculiarities of human nature, whenever an established routine was broken, there was usually something amiss. She was just reaching for her prayer book when an urgent knocking came at the front door. Miss Marple's maid, a rather excitable girl named Lucy, hurried to answer it, and moments later, Mrs. Harmon, the vicar's wife, was shown into the sitting room. Her normally placid face was flushed with distress, her hat slightly askew. "Oh, Miss Marple," she exclaimed, quite forgetting to say good morning. "The most dreadful thing has happened. Mr. Simmons hasn't appeared to ring the bells, and when Reverend Harmon went to see what had detained him, he found the church door unlocked and signs of some disturbance in the bell tower. It's most unlike Mr. Simmons. He's been verger for over 20 years and has never once failed in his duties." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, reaching for her coat. "That does sound most concerning. Perhaps we should go and see if we can be of assistance." The two ladies set off immediately, Mrs. Harmon continuing to express her bewilderment at the verger's absence. "He's such a reliable man, you know. Takes such pride in the bells. Especially old Gabriel. That's the oldest bell in the tower, cast in 1485, the year of the Battle of Bosworth Field. Mr. Simmons often says it has a voice that has called across more than 4 centuries. As they approached the church, Miss Marple observed a small crowd gathering outside the ancient oak doors. Colonel Bantry, tall and distinguished with his military bearing, was in earnest conversation with Reverend Harmon, whose usually serene countenance was now grave with concern. "Ah, Miss Marple," said Colonel Bantry, turning as they approached. "A most unfortunate business." "You've found Mr. Simmons?" inquired Miss Marple quietly. The colonel exchanged a glance with Reverend Harmon before replying. "I'm afraid so. It seems the poor fellow has had a dreadful accident. Appears to have fallen from the bell tower. We've sent for Inspector Slack and Dr. Haydock, of course." "How terrible," said Miss Marple. "May I see—" Despite some protestation from Mrs. Harmon about the upsetting nature of the scene, Miss Marple was led into the church. The ancient building was cool and dim, with shafts of coloured light from the stained glass windows, creating pools of ruby and sapphire on the stone floor. The tranquillity of the scene contrasted sharply with the knot of men gathered at the base of the spiral staircase that led to the bell tower. There, sprawled in an awkward attitude that immediately suggested to Miss Marple that something was not quite right, lay the body of Mr. Simmons. The elderly verger's face was peaceful, despite the awkward angle of his limbs. Around him, scattered like fallen leaves, were sheets of music from the choir loft. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp despite her advanced years, took in several details at once. The bell ropes, visible through the open trapdoor above, had been neatly coiled rather than left hanging, as would be natural if Mr. Simmons had been preparing to ring them. The verger's white hair was matted with blood at the back of his head, but there was remarkably little blood on the stone floor around him, and poking from his waistcoat pocket was a silver chain, But the pocket watch that Mr. Simmons was known to prize, a gift from the previous vicar upon 20 years of service, was nowhere to be seen. "Has anything been moved?" she asked quietly. "Nothing at all," said Colonel Bantry. "We know better than to disturb things before the police arrive." Miss Marple nodded approvingly and continued her careful observation. Her gaze travelled upward, along the ancient stone walls to the bell chamber above. Through the open trapdoor, she could just make out the massive shapes of the bells, hanging silent in their cradles. "I should like to see the bell tower, if I may," she said. Colonel Bantry looked doubtful. "I'm not sure that's wise, Miss Marple. Those stairs are steep and treacherous. Indeed, that's undoubtedly what led to poor Simmons's demise." "Nevertheless," said Miss Marple with gentle firmness. Recognizing the determination behind her mild exterior, Colonel Bantry offered his arm, and together they ascended the narrow spiral staircase. The steps were indeed worn and uneven, polished by centuries of feet. At the top, they emerged into the bell chamber, a space dominated by the massive bronze bells that hung from ancient oak beams. Miss Marple moved carefully around the chamber, her eyes taking in every detail. She noted the dust on the floor, disturbed by recent footprints, and the tools of the verger's trade laid out on a small wooden table, all except for one, a slot in the felt-lined case conspicuously empty. But it was the largest and oldest of the bells that drew her attention most keenly. "That would be old Gabriel, I presume?" she inquired, pointing to the massive bell with its patina of age. "Indeed," said Colonel Bantry. "Cast at the end of the Wars of the Roses, or so local tradition has it." Miss Marple moved closer, examining the bell's surface. There, on the ancient bronze, was a fresh scratch, a bright line against the weathered metal, as if someone had recently taken a tool to its surface. Their examination was interrupted by voices from below announcing the arrival of Inspector Slack. As they descended, Miss Marple heard the inspector's brusque tones already dismissing the possibility of anything more than a tragic accident. "Elderly man, steep stairs, poor lighting. It's clear enough what happened," he was saying as they rejoined the group. "Perhaps," said Miss Marple mildly, "but there are one or two things that strike me as rather odd." Inspector Slack's expression made it clear what he thought of Miss Marple's observations. "With all due respect, Miss Marple, this appears to be a straightforward accident. The verger was 70 if he was a day. These old stone stairs would be treacherous for a much younger man." "That may well be," agreed Miss Marple. "But it doesn't explain why the bell ropes are neatly coiled, or why Mr. Simmons's pocket watch is missing, or indeed, why there is a fresh scratch on the surface of old Gabriel." Before Inspector Slack could dismiss these points, Dr. Haydock arrived, immediately bending to examine the body with professional efficiency. After a few minutes, he straightened, his face grave. "Well, this complicates matters," he said. "Mr. Simmons did not die from the fall, Inspector. He was struck on the head beforehand, with considerable force, I might add. The wound is not consistent with impact on these stone floors, and rigor mortis suggests he died sometime last night, not this morning." A murmur ran through the small group. Inspector Slack's expression darkened. "You're certain, Doctor?" "Quite certain," replied Dr. Haydock. "This was no accident. Mr. Simmons was murdered." As the implications of this statement rippled through the church, Miss Marple stood quietly, her mind already connecting this grim discovery with something she had heard just last week, a snippet of conversation about a distinguished visitor to the village. A Professor Ainsworth, who had apparently shown great interest in examining old Gabriel, had been overheard speaking with Mr. Simmons in the churchyard. The verger had seemed troubled afterward, and when Miss Marple had inquired if anything was amiss, he had merely shaken his head and muttered something about some bells being better left unrung, and some secrets being better left buried in the past. Now, as the morning sun filtered through the stained glass to illuminate the still form of the verger, Miss Marple wondered what secret old Gabriel might be hiding, a secret perhaps worth killing for. Chapter 2. Whispers Among Tombstones. The following morning found Miss Marple seated in the small vestry of St. Mary's Church, surrounded by ancient parish records bound in cracked leather. She had explained to the somewhat flustered church secretary that she was researching her family history, a harmless prevarication that few would question in a lady of her years. In truth, she was searching for any mention of old Gabriel and its history. Her fingers, surprisingly nimble despite their age, carefully turned pages yellowed with time. So absorbed was she in her task that she didn't immediately notice the young man who had entered the vestry until he spoke. "Finding anything of interest, Miss Marple?" She looked up to see Mr. Lawrence Redding, the new curate who had arrived in St. Mary Mead just 3 weeks prior. He was a handsome young man with intelligent eyes and a manner that suggested education beyond what was typical for a country curate. "Good morning, Mr. Redding," she replied pleasantly, just indulging an old woman's curiosity about church history. "Ah, our bells have quite a history indeed," he said, moving closer to examine the records she was perusing. "Particularly old Gabriel. Did you know it was cast in the very year that saw the end of the Wars of the Roses, 1485, when Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at Bosworth Field?" "Indeed." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes registered mild interest, though inwardly she noted the young man's unexpected knowledge. "How fascinating. Have you studied campanology, Mr. Redding?" "An amateur interest only," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Professor Ainsworth, who's been staying at the Blue Boar, is the real expert. He's been documenting medieval bell inscriptions for a scholarly publication. Quite excited about old Gabriel, from what I gather." "I believe I've seen the professor in the village," Miss Marple said. "A tall gentleman with a grey beard. I noticed him speaking with Mr. Simmons last week." A shadow passed across the curate's face. "Yes, poor Mr. Simmons. A terrible business. I understand Inspector Slack is treating it as suspicious now." "So it would seem," Miss Marple murmured, returning her attention to the records. "By the way, when were these bells last examined? For maintenance, I mean." "There was a comprehensive survey about 5 years ago," Redding replied, "though Professor Ainsworth has been lobbying the church committee for permission to conduct a more detailed examination of old Gabriel specifically. Something about unique casting techniques of the period." Miss Marple made a non-committal sound and continued her examination of the records until Mr. Redding excused himself for his morning duties. When she was sure he had gone, she turned back several pages to an entry she had marked, a brief note dating from 1947 about repairs to the bell tower that mentioned the curious inscription within old Gabriel, believed to date from its casting. Meanwhile, Inspector Slack was conducting his own investigations with considerably less subtlety. In the church hall, he was interviewing Mrs. Mackintosh, the elderly woman who had cleaned the church for the past 30 years. "And you say you saw Mr. Simmons speaking with someone in the churchyard on Saturday evening?" the inspector demanded. "That I did," confirmed Mrs. Mackintosh, her work-worn hands nervously smoothing her apron. "Just as I was finishing up, around 6 o'clock, Mr. Simmons was by the old yew tree, talking most intensely with a gentleman I didn't recognize. Not from the village, he wasn't." "Can you describe this person?" "Tall, distinguished-looking, grey beard, wearing one of those tweed jackets with the leather patches on the elbows like university professors wear. And what were they discussing? Pressed Slack. I couldn't hear everything, but Mr. Simmons seemed agitated, kept saying something must remain silent. I thought perhaps they were discussing the choir. You know how particular Mr. Simmons was about proper singing in church. Inspector Slack made a note, his expression skeptical. Anything else you recall, Mrs. McIntosh? The cleaner hesitated. Well, it's probably nothing. But when I went to lock up, I noticed Mr. Simmons had left his toolbox open in the bell tower. Most unlike him. He was always so particular about his equipment. After the inspector had dismissed Mrs. McIntosh, Miss Marple slipped quietly from the vestry and made her way into the churchyard. The spring sunshine cast dappled shadows through the ancient yew trees, illuminating weathered gravestones that leaned at haphazard angles. She moved with purpose toward a particular section where the oldest graves were located. There she found what she was looking for, a tomb set apart from the others, grander and better preserved. It bore the weathered effigy of a woman in medieval dress, her hands clasped in prayer. Though time had softened the features, there was still a suggestion of formidable character in the face. The inscription identified it as the resting place of Lady Margaret Beaufort, a historical figure connected to the Tudor dynasty. What caught Miss Marple's attention, however, were the fresh flowers placed at the foot of the tomb, spring bluebells arranged with care. Someone had visited this ancient grave recently. As she studied the tomb, she became aware of shuffling footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Tom Jenkins, the elderly gardener who tended the churchyard. His face was deeply lined from decades of outdoor work, his back bent with age. "Good morning, Tom," she greeted him. "Morning, Miss Marple." He touched his cap respectfully. "Admiring Lady Margaret's tomb, are you?" "Indeed. I was just noticing these lovely bluebells. Recently placed, I think." Tom nodded. "Aye, Mr. Simmons put them there on Friday. Curious, that was. In all my years I've never seen him paying particular attention to this tomb before last week." "Really?" Miss Marple feigned mild interest. "How strange." "Strange it was," agreed Tom. "He spent a good hour here last Wednesday, making rubbings of the inscription with paper and charcoal, muttering to himself all the while. When I asked what he was about, he just said he was confirming a suspicion." Miss Marple gazed thoughtfully at the tomb. Lady Margaret Beaufort. She would have been alive when old Gabriel was cast, wouldn't she? That she would. Mother of Henry VII she was. Quite the formidable lady by all accounts. Local legend has it she visited St. Mary Mead and made a donation toward the casting of the church bells. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of measured footsteps on the gravel path. A tall, bearded man approached, accompanied by a thin woman of indeterminate age, whose severe features were accentuated by her hair pulled back in a tight bun. She carried a notebook and seemed to be taking down every word the man spoke. "Ah, Professor Ainsworth, I presume," said Miss Marple with a benign smile. The professor looked startled, then composed his features into a professional mask of courtesy. "Indeed. And you are?" "Miss Marple, a resident of the village. I couldn't help noticing your interest in our bell tower. I saw you taking measurements yesterday." "Yes, fascinating structure," he replied, his tone suggesting he wished to terminate the conversation. "Medieval bell towers have been a lifelong study of mine." "And particularly old Gabriel, I understand," pressed Miss Marple gently. "Such a historic bell must have many stories to tell." A flicker of something, alarm, annoyance, crossed the professor's face. All old bells have their stories, Miss Marple. If you'll excuse us, my secretary, Miss Grantham, and I have measurements to complete before the light fails." As they moved away, Miss Marple overheard Miss Grantham murmuring, "Should we be concerned about her interest?" "Nonsense," the professor replied, though not without a backward glance. "Just a nosy village spinster." Miss Marple smiled to herself. Being underestimated had its advantages. She spent another hour in the churchyard, ostensibly admiring the spring flowers, but actually observing the professor's methodical examination of the bell tower's exterior. He was paying particular attention to the eastern wall, where an ancient buttress supported the tower. His secretary took copious notes and several photographs. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple attended evensong. The service was subdued, the congregation still shocked by the verger's death. With no one to ring the bells, a recording of church bells had been played through the speaker system, a poor substitute for the real thing, in Miss Marple's opinion. She chose a seat near the back, which afforded her a good view of the congregation. Professor Ainsworth was present, sitting stiffly in a pew across the aisle. Miss Grantham was not with him. Mr. Redding conducted part of the service, his rich voice reading the lessons with appropriate gravity. Miss Marple noticed that his eyes occasionally drifted toward the bell tower entrance. After the service, she lingered, waiting until most of the congregation had departed. Then, moving with deliberate casualness, she approached the rack of hymn books. As she replaced the book she had used, her fingers deftly explored the others, pausing when she felt something tucked between the pages of one. Glancing around to ensure she was unobserved, Miss Marple extracted a torn piece of paper from the hymnal. The fragment appeared to be part of a larger document, the edges jagged where it had been ripped. Written upon it in faded ink was what appeared to be a coded message. She could make out the words, "The King's Truth," hidden in bronze. Just as she was slipping the paper into her handbag, a shadow fell across her. Miss Marple looked up to see Mr. Redding watching her, his expression unreadable. "Finding everything you need, Miss Marple?" he asked quietly. "Oh, yes, thank you," she replied, with the innocent smile that had disarmed so many over the years. "Though I do miss the sound of the bells. There's something so comforting about their familiar tones, don't you think? Especially old Gabriel. Such a deep, resonant voice from the past." "Yes," said Mr. Redding slowly. "Some voices from the past are impossible to silence, aren't they? No matter how long they've been quiet." Their eyes met for a long moment, and Miss Marple had the distinct impression that they were having two conversations at once, the spoken exchange of pleasantries, and another, unspoken communication, layered with meaning. As she walked home in the gathering dusk, Miss Marple's mind was busy categorizing and connecting the various threads of information she had gathered. Mr. Simmons's unusual interest in Lady Margaret Beaufort's tomb, the professor's focus on old Gabriel, the curate's unexpected knowledge of bell history, the fragment of coded message referring to the King's Truth. And weaving through it all, the silenced bells of St. Mary Mead and the body of a man who had apparently discovered something that someone was willing to kill to keep secret. Chapter 3. The Verger's Confession. The morning light filtered through the delicate lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage as she poured tea for her visitor. Colonel Bantry sat opposite her, his military bearing somewhat at odds with the feminine chintz and china that surrounded him, but he seemed comfortable enough, having been a friend of Miss Marple's for many years. "Most disturbing business, this affair at the church," he said, accepting a cup of Earl Grey with a nod of thanks. "Slack seems convinced it's connected to some petty theft, the missing pocket watch and so forth. But I'm not so sure." "No," agreed Miss Marple, offering him a plate of homemade scones. I rather think there's more to it than that. Tell me, Colonel, did Mr. Simmons ever speak to you about anything unusual he might have discovered? The Colonel paused, his cup halfway to his lips. As a matter of fact, he did. Came to see me last Thursday, 3 days before his death. Said he needed advice about a matter of historical significance that could cause great disturbance. His words, not mine. And did he elaborate? Miss Marple asked, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she worked on what appeared to be a baby's shawl. Unfortunately not. We were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Haydock. I'd been having some trouble with my knee, you see. Simmons said he'd come back the following day, but he never did. The Colonel frowned. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now... Indeed, murmured Miss Marple. Did he seem afraid, Colonel? Not afraid, precisely. Concerned, certainly. Almost excited, in a way. Like a man who's made a momentous discovery. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Lucy showed in Mrs. Simmons, the verger's widow, a small, neat woman with reddened eyes, but a composure that spoke of inner strength. I hope I'm not intruding, she said hesitantly. Not at all, Miss Marple assured her, rising to pour another cup of tea. Colonel Bantry and I were just discussing your husband. Please, join us? When Mrs. Simmons was settled with tea and a scone, Miss Marple gently steered the conversation. I understand your husband had been working on a history of St. Mary's Church. Mrs. Simmons nodded. Yes, it was his great passion these last few years. He'd spend hours in the parish records making notes. A shadow crossed her face. He'd been particularly excited recently about something he'd found. Something to do with old Gabriel. The bell? Prompted Miss Marple. Yes, he'd discovered a reference in the old records, a mention of a secret message concealed in the bell during the Tudor period. At first he thought it was just a local legend, but then he found more references in private papers from the 18th century. He became quite obsessed with the idea. Mrs. Simmons twisted her handkerchief. Then last week, that professor arrived, asking questions about the bells. Professor Ainsworth, said Miss Marple. Yes, he seemed to know about the legend already. Offered my husband a substantial sum, for the church restoration fund, of course, if he would allow him private access to examine old Gabriel more closely. And did your husband agree? Asked Colonel Bantry. Mrs. Simmons hesitated. Initially, yes. The church roof desperately needs repairs, and the money would have been a godsend. But then William, Mr. Simmons, changed his mind. He said he'd realized that whatever was hidden in the bell might be of great historical significance and should be properly documented through official channels. The morning of that same day found St. Mary Mead abuzz with the news that Professor Ainsworth had formally requested permission from the church committee to temporarily remove old Gabriel for what he termed scholarly examination. The proposal had sharply divided opinion. Reverend Harmon, ever practical, pointed out that the professor's generous donation would fund much-needed repairs. Others, led by Colonel Bantry, expressed concern about removing such a historic artifact, even temporarily. Miss Marple, hearing this news from her gardener, who had it from his cousin who cleaned the vicarage, decided it was time to pay a condolence call on Mrs. Simmons. The verger's cottage stood in the shadow of the church, a neat little building with roses already budding along its front path. Mrs. Simmons welcomed her with quiet gratitude. As Miss Marple had anticipated, the visit soon turned to memories of Mr. Simmons and his devotion to the church. What she had not anticipated was Mrs. Simmons leading her into the small back garden, where a patch of freshly turned earth caught her observant eye. William was out here the night before he died, Mrs. Simmons explained, following Miss Marple's gaze. I watched from the kitchen window. He seemed to be burying something. I meant to ask him about it in the morning, but... She trailed off, and Miss Marple gently patted her hand. Perhaps we should see what it was, she suggested softly. It might be important. With Mrs. Simmons's permission, Miss Marple borrowed a trowel from the garden shed and carefully began to dig in the disturbed area. It didn't take long to unearth a metal box, the kind once used for storing cigars. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture, were several items. A small notebook filled with Mr. Simmons's neat handwriting, what appeared to be a charcoal rubbing of an inscription, and a sealed envelope addressed to Reverend Harmon, marked, "To be opened in the event of my unexpected death." Mrs. Simmons gasped at the sight of the letter. He knew, she whispered. William knew something might happen to him. Inside the cottage, they carefully examined the contents of the box. The notebook contained Mr. Simmons's research on St. Mary's Church, with particular focus on Old Gabriel. The final entries, dated just days before his death, were particularly revealing. Have confirmed references to Old Gabriel containing evidence that could write Tudor history. Approached by A, offering substantial sum for exclusive access. Initially agreed for sake of church roof, but on further reflection, realize historical significance demands proper documentation and disclosure. We'll speak to Colonel B for advice on how to proceed. And the final entry, dated the day before his death. A, most insistent, becoming concerned about his true motives. G, also making inquiries, claims family connection to Plantagenet line. Must secure evidence before proceeding further. The rubbing appeared to be from inside the bell itself. A partial inscription in medieval Latin, which neither Miss Marple nor Mrs. Simmons could fully decipher. We must take this letter to Reverend Harmon at once, said Miss Marple, carefully returning the other items to the box. They found the vicar in his study, visibly tired from the strain of recent events. He accepted the letter with surprise, breaking the seal with a paper knife from his desk. My dear Reverend Harmon, he read aloud. If you are reading this, then my fears have been realized. I have recently made a discovery of great historical significance concerning Old Gabriel, which I believe contains evidence relating to a matter of Tudor history that has long been disputed. I was initially approached by Professor Ainsworth, who offered a generous donation to the church in exchange for private access to examine the bell. I regret to say that I first accepted this offer, believing it would benefit the church. However, upon further reflection and additional research, I have come to realize that what may be found could be of such historical importance that it should be properly documented through official academic channels. I have changed my mind about the private arrangement, which has caused some discord. Should anything happen to me, I urge you to ensure that any examination of Old Gabriel is conducted with proper witnesses and documentation. The truth, whatever it may be, deserves to be known. Yours faithfully, William Simmons. The vicar looked up, his face grave. This is most disturbing. It suggests Mr. Simmons believed his discovery might put him in danger. And it would appear he was right, said Miss Marple quietly. They were interrupted by a breathless young boy, the vicar's son, bursting into the study. Father, Inspector Slack sent me to fetch you. Someone's tried to break into the bell tower. They've damaged the old lock. The news galvanized them into action. Within minutes, they had joined a small crowd gathered at the church, where Inspector Slack was examining the ancient oak door that led to the bell tower. The lock, a massive iron mechanism that had secured the tower for generations, had been partially prized from the wood surrounding it. Looks like they were interrupted before they could get in, Slack was explaining to Colonel Bantry. Night watchman we posted heard the noise and raised the alarm, but whoever it was had disappeared by the time he got here." "The bell?" said Miss Marple, stepping forward. "You must check if old Gabriel has been tampered with." Slack looked as if he might dismiss her suggestion, but the vicar intervened. "Miss Marple may well be right, Inspector. There's reason to believe that the bell itself may be what the intruder was after." He briefly explained the letter they had just discovered. A careful examination of the bell tower revealed that the intruder had not succeeded in gaining access. Old Gabriel hung undisturbed in its cradle, its ancient bronze surface gleaming dully in the flashlight beams. "I'm posting a constable here round the clock," declared Inspector Slack. "And I want that letter, Vicar, as evidence." As they descended from the tower, Miss Marple noticed Professor Ainsworth hovering at the edge of the crowd, his face a mask of scholarly concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. Standing slightly apart, but watching the proceedings intently, was Miss Grantham, her severe features animated by an emotion Miss Marple couldn't immediately identify. Excitement? Anticipation? Later that evening, as darkness fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat in her cottage, carefully examining the notebook and rubbing she had, somewhat improperly, retained when handing over the letter to Reverend Harmon. The partial inscription, from what she could make out with the help of her Latin dictionary, seemed to reference princes and the truth concealed by command of the lady. Her contemplation was interrupted by the telephone ringing. It was Colonel Bantry, his voice tense with excitement. "Miss Marple, the most extraordinary development. Inspector Slack has agreed to interview Professor Ainsworth formally tomorrow. It seems the professor has a rather interesting background. He doesn't just represent himself. He's acting for a private collector, someone with particular interest in Tudor artifacts and, apparently, the financial resources to acquire them by any means necessary." "Indeed," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "And what of Miss Grantham? Has the inspector looked into her background as well?" "Not yet, but I've taken the liberty of making some inquiries through an old military colleague. Should have information by morning." As she replaced the receiver, Miss Marple gazed out of her window toward the darkened silhouette of the church tower against the night sky. Whatever secret old Gabriel held had remained hidden for over 4 centuries. Now it had emerged just enough to claim a life and set in motion events that threatened to uncover a truth someone desperately wanted to keep concealed. The question was, who had the most to gain or lose from what the ancient bell might reveal? Chapter 4. Secrets Cast in Bronze. St. Mary's Church stood silent under police guard the following morning, the yellow spring sunshine contrasting sharply with the somber mood that had descended over the village. Inspector Slack had established his temporary headquarters in the church hall, where he was currently facing Professor Ainsworth across a scarred wooden table. Miss Marple, having presented herself as a witness with potentially relevant information, sat quietly in a corner, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked. The inspector had objected to her presence, but Colonel Bantry's firm insistence had won the day. "Professor," Slack was saying, "I have here a journal belonging to the late Mr. Simmons, which suggests you offered him payment for private access to examine old Gabriel. Would you care to explain?" The professor stroked his beard, his academic composure firmly in place. "I made no secret of my interest in the bell, Inspector. As I explained to the church committee, I represent the Trelawney Foundation, a private institution specializing in Tudor artifacts." "And why the particular interest in this specific bell?" pressed Slack. Professor Ainsworth hesitated, glancing briefly at Miss Marple before answering. "Very well. The Foundation believes, based on considerable historical research, that old Gabriel may contain evidence relating to one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries, the fate of the princes in the tower. A murmur ran through the small room. Even Inspector Slack looked startled. "The nephews of Richard III?" he asked. "The boys who disappeared?" "Precisely," confirmed Ainsworth. "Young Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York, disappeared from the Tower of London in 1483. Traditionally, their uncle Richard III has been blamed for their murders, largely due to Tudor propaganda after Henry VII seized the throne." Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. "But what could a church bell in St. Mary Mead possibly have to do with the prince's fate?" she inquired innocently. The professor turned to her, clearly recognizing the intelligence behind the mild blue eyes. St. Mary Mead had connections to Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII. Historical records indicate she commissioned old Gabriel in 1485 after her son's victory at Bosworth Field. "And you believe the bell contains some sort of message about the princes?" asked Colonel Bantry. "Records suggest that Lady Margaret may have known the truth about what happened to the princes, a truth that, if revealed, might have undermined her son's claim to the throne. The Trelawney Foundation believes she may have ensured that evidence was preserved, but in a location where it would remain secret during her lifetime." "Inside a church bell?" Inspector Slack's skepticism was evident. At this point, Mr. Redding, who had been sitting quietly near the door, spoke up. "It's not as far-fetched as it sounds, Inspector. Medieval bell founders sometimes included documents or small artifacts within bells during the casting process, a method of preservation, if you will." All eyes turned to the young curate. Miss Marple noted the flash of annoyance that crossed Professor Ainsworth's face at this interruption. "Indeed," Redding continued, "the molten bronze would flow around the object, sealing it within. Once cooled, it would be protected from air and moisture, potentially preserving it for centuries." "And you know this how, exactly?" asked Slack suspiciously. "Before taking holy orders, I studied medieval metallurgy," Redding replied calmly. "An unusual path, perhaps, but one that has given me appreciation for the craftsmanship of sacred objects." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythmic clicking. Another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Mr. Redding's unexpected knowledge of bells was now explained. "So," said Inspector Slack, returning his attention to Professor Ainsworth, "you believe this bell contains evidence about the prince's fate, evidence that could write Tudor history, as Mr. Simmons put it?" "Potentially, yes," admitted the professor. "If, as we suspect, it contains proof that the princes were alive after Richard's death, it would suggest that Henry VII, not Richard III, was responsible for their disappearance. A rather significant historical revision." "And worth killing for?" Slack's question hung in the air. "Inspector," protested Ainsworth, "I categorically deny any involvement in Mr. Simmons's death. Yes, I offered payment for scholarly access to the bell, but when he refused, I respected his decision and applied through proper channels to the church committee." "And yet," said Colonel Bantry quietly, "someone tried to break into the bell tower the very night after his death." The questioning continued for another hour, with Professor Ainsworth maintaining his innocence while confirming his keen interest in examining old Gabriel. When finally dismissed, he departed with evident relief, unaware that Miss Marple's sharp eyes had noted the slight tremor in his hands as he gathered his papers. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the local museum, a small affair housed in what had once been the manor house of St. Mary Mead. The curator, a retired schoolmaster named Mr. Pettigrew, was delighted by her interest in local Tudor connections. "Indeed, Miss Marple," St. Mary Mead was a safe haven for loyalists during the transition from Plantagenet to Tudor rule, he explained, showing her ancient maps of the area. Lady Margaret Beaufort had connections to the village through her second marriage. In fact, she commissioned old Gabriel as a thanksgiving for her son's victory at Bosworth. Miss Marple studied the documents with interest. And old Gabriel was cast in 1485, the very year Henry took the throne? Indeed, cast by the finest bell founder in England at the time. There are records of Lady Margaret personally overseeing certain aspects of the casting process, which was most unusual for a woman of her station. How fascinating, murmured Miss Marple. I've heard there might be some sort of inscription inside the bell. Ah, you've heard the old legend? Pettigrew smiled. Yes, old Gabriel is said to carry a message within. There's a reference to it in this 17th century account. He carefully opened an ancient ledger. See here. The great bell holds a secret from the first Tudor's rise, known only to the lady and the craftsman, both now dust. As Miss Marple left the museum, her mind was working furiously. The historical context was beginning to make sense. Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, personally involved in the creation of a bell that might contain evidence about the princes in the Tower, evidence that could potentially implicate her own son in their disappearance rather than Richard III, as Tudor propaganda had claimed for centuries. Her contemplation was interrupted by the sight of two figures standing by the church gate. Miss Grantham in earnest conversation with a tall, distinguished man Miss Marple hadn't seen before. They parted quickly upon noticing her approach, the man walking briskly away, while Miss Grantham pretended absorbed interest in a notice on the church board. "Good afternoon," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Such a lovely day, isn't it?" Miss Grantham gave a curt nod. "Indeed." "I understand you're Professor Ainsworth's secretary," continued Miss Marple. "How interesting his work must be, studying historical bells." "I merely assist with documentation," replied Miss Grantham stiffly. "Of course. Though I imagine with something as potentially significant as evidence about the princes in the Tower, the work takes on special importance." Miss Marple's tone was conversational, but her eyes were sharp, particularly for anyone with connections to the families involved. Miss Grantham's head snapped up. "What do you mean?" "Oh, merely that history affects us all differently. Some might see the Tudor version of events as established fact, while others, perhaps those with Plantagenet connections, might have a different perspective." A flush spread across Miss Grantham's pale features. Without another word, she turned and hurried away, leaving Miss Marple to ponder the reaction her carefully placed probe had elicited. That evening, determined to examine old Gabriel more closely, Miss Marple approached the church, armed with the excuse of retrieving a prayer book she had supposedly left after morning service. The constable on duty, young P.C. Pork, who had known Miss Marple since boyhood, was easily persuaded to allow her entry. As she climbed the spiral staircase to the bell tower, she was surprised to hear voices above. Pausing in the shadows of the stairwell, she listened. "Absolutely certain. This technology can detect it without removal?" It was Professor Ainsworth's voice. "The scanner can identify density variations within the metal," replied another voice, Mr. Redding's. "If there's a cavity or foreign object embedded in the bell, it will show up clearly." Miss Marple ascended the remaining steps to find the two men with a third, a technician, operating what appeared to be sophisticated equipment directed at old Gabriel. "Miss Marple!" exclaimed the professor, clearly startled. "What are you doing here?" "I might ask the same of you, Professor," she replied calmly. "I wasn't aware Inspector Slack had authorized an examination of the bell." A preliminary scan only, said Redding quickly. Non-invasive. The inspector approved it this afternoon. The technician, who had been studying a small screen attached to his equipment, suddenly straightened. There's definitely something there, Professor. An anomaly within the metal near the crown of the bell. All eyes turned to old Gabriel, hanging silent and imposing in its cradle. The ancient bronze surface gleamed dully in the light from the single overhead bulb, its secrets held for over 4 centuries. The moment was shattered by a piercing scream from outside. They rushed to the tower window, then descended the stairs in haste. In the churchyard, illuminated by the rising moon, stood Miss Grantham, her face a mask of horror as she stood over the prone form of Mr. Redding, who lay unconscious beside an open grave. By the time Miss Marple reached them, Colonel Bantry had appeared from the darkness, having heard the commotion while walking his dog nearby. Together, they determined that Redding, while badly injured, was alive. "Ambulance is on its way," the colonel announced, having dispatched P.C. Polk to telephone for assistance. "What happened here, Miss Grantham?" I don't know," she stammered. "I was walking past the church and saw a figure by this grave. When I approached, I found him like this." Miss Marple knelt carefully beside the injured man, her eyes sharp despite the dim light. Something was clutched in Redding's hand, a paper that appeared to be a rubbing showing a partial inscription. Despite the poor light, she could make out words that seemed to refer to the princes and the truth of their fate. As Redding was carried away to the hospital, Miss Marple exchanged a significant look with Colonel Bantry. The mystery was deepening, with new questions arising at every turn. Who had attacked the curate? What had he discovered about old Gabriel? And most puzzling of all, what secret had remained hidden for over 4 centuries that was still dangerous enough to kill for? Their silent communion was broken by the most unexpected sound, the deep, sonorous tone of old Gabriel, ringing out a single mournful note that echoed across the sleeping village. All eyes turned to the bell tower in astonishment. "That's impossible," breathed Professor Ainsworth. "We were just there. There was no one else in the tower." Yet as they watched, no further sounds came from the bell that had rung against all logic at precisely midnight. Chapter 5. The Midnight Ringer. The morning after old Gabriel's mysterious midnight tolling dawned with a buzz of excitement throughout St. Mary Mead. Villagers gathered in hushed groups, speculating about supernatural forces and ancient curses. Miss Marple, however, approaching the church with Colonel Bantry by her side, was considering far more earthly explanations. "Mechanical timers, perhaps," suggested the colonel. "Or someone with access to the bell tower that we're not aware of." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "Though I'm more interested in what Mr. Redding might have discovered before he was attacked." They had just received word from the hospital that the curate was conscious, but still too weak for questioning. Inspector Slack had posted additional constables around the church, his initial skepticism about the historical significance of old Gabriel now thoroughly dispelled. As they approached, they saw a small crowd gathered at the base of the tower. Inspector Slack was addressing Professor Ainsworth and several members of the church committee. The professor was gesticulating emphatically, his academic reserve giving way to evident excitement. "What's happening?" Colonel Bantry asked a bystander. "They've found something," came the hushed reply. "A hidden chamber in the bell tower wall. Lightning struck the tower during the night, dislodged some masonry, and revealed it." Indeed, as they drew closer, Miss Marple could see that part of the ancient stonework had crumbled away, revealing a small cavity within the thick wall. Reverend Harmon was carefully extracting what appeared to be a small leather pouch from the opening. "Most extraordinary," the vicar was saying. "It appears the lightning strike loosened stones that were deliberately placed to conceal this cavity." The leather, darkened with age, had remarkably preserved whatever lay within. With careful hands, Reverend Harmon opened the pouch and withdrew a sealed parchment bearing a royal seal, the Tudor rose clearly visible in the red wax, along with a small golden emblem. "The royal seal of Henry VII," breathed Professor Ainsworth, his eyes wide with academic fervor. "And a Tudor rose emblem. This is unprecedented." Inspector Slack immediately took charge. "This evidence needs to be properly secured. Reverend, I'll need to take this into custody." "Surely it should be examined first," protested the professor. "By qualified historians." "It will be," Slack assured him, "but following proper procedures. For now, I suggest it be secured in the vicar's safe until experts from the British Museum can be summoned." This compromise satisfied all parties, and the parchment and emblem were carefully transported to the vicarage, where they were locked in Reverend Harmon's study safe. The professor was permitted to photograph the seal and emblem for his records, but the parchment remained sealed, its contents still a mystery. By mid-afternoon, the excitement had hardly abated. Miss Marple, having returned home for a light luncheon, was just considering whether to make another visit to the church when her telephone rang. It was Colonel Bantry, his voice tight with tension. "Miss Marple, you'd better come to the vicarage at once. The parchment has been stolen." She arrived to find the vicarage in disarray. Inspector Slack was interrogating a visibly distressed Reverend Harmon, while constables searched the premises. Mrs. Harmon, pale but composed, was serving tea to Colonel Bantry in the parlour. "What happened?" Miss Marple asked, accepting a cup of tea with a grateful nod. "The vicar went to check on the safe about an hour ago and found it open," explained the colonel. "The parchment is gone, though oddly enough, the golden emblem remains." "Who knew about the safe?" "That's the problem. Quite a few people. The professor, of course. Miss Grantham was seen near the vicarage this afternoon, and Redding had been here many times in his capacity as curate." Miss Marple considered this information. "I think," she said finally, "that it's time I visited the local museum again. There's a historical connection here that I'm not quite grasping." The museum was quiet at this late afternoon hour. Mr. Pettigrew welcomed her with pleasure, clearly delighted to have a visitor with genuine interest in local history. "I'm particularly interested in St. Mary Mead's connections during the Tudor transition," Miss Marple explained. "You mentioned that Lady Margaret Beaufort had links to the village?" "Indeed," Pettigrew confirmed, leading her to a display of maps and documents. "St. Mary Mead was something of a safe haven for loyalists during the transition from Plantagenet to Tudor rule. This area," he pointed to a section of an ancient map, "was known as Beaufort's Retreat. Lady Margaret would come here when requiring absolute privacy." "And old Gabriel was commissioned by her as a thanksgiving?" "Yes, though there's more to the story." Pettigrew lowered his voice conspiratorially, though they were alone in the museum. "Local tradition suggests she had a more specific purpose. You see, bells were not merely instruments for calling worshippers. They were believed to have protective qualities. The right bell, rung at the right time, could ward off evil or protect secrets." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with understanding. "So, Lady Margaret might have seen the bell as a way to protect a secret as well as a Thanksgiving offering?" "Precisely. And there's a fascinating entry in the parish records from 1598, during Elizabeth I's reign, that mentions the truth sealed in bronze that must never ring forth. Most scholars assumed it was merely metaphorical." As Miss Marple left the museum, her mind was piecing together the historical puzzle. Lady Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VIII, had commissioned old Gabriel in the very year her son took the throne from Richard III. The bell potentially contained evidence about the princes in the tower, evidence that might implicate the Tudor dynasty rather than Richard III in their disappearance. Such a revision of history would have profound implications, even centuries later. For Tudor loyalists, it would be a stain on a dynasty traditionally portrayed as England's saviours from the villainous Richard. For Plantagenet sympathisers, it would be vindication of a king long maligned by Tudor propaganda. Her contemplation was interrupted when she reached the church and found Professor Ainsworth on his hands and knees at the base of the bell tower, examining the fallen masonry with intense concentration. When he saw Miss Marple, he quickly stood, brushing dust from his tweeds. "Ah, Miss Marple, just examining the structural damage from the lightning strike. Fascinating how it revealed that hidden cavity." "Indeed," she agreed, almost as if the lightning knew exactly where to strike. His eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" "Merely that coincidences can be remarkable. A hidden chamber containing Tudor documents, revealed just as interest in old Gabriel reaches its peak. Scientific equipment had already detected anomalies in the bell," he pointed out stiffly. "The discovery was inevitable." "Perhaps. Though I wonder what Mr. Redding had discovered before he was attacked." The professor's expression changed subtly. "I've just come from the hospital. The doctors say he's recovering well but remembers nothing of the attack." "How convenient," murmured Miss Marple. As darkness fell, Miss Marple made her way to the hospital, determined to see the injured curate for herself. She found Mr. Redding pale but alert, his head bandaged where he had been struck. "Miss Marple," he greeted her weakly, "I suspected you might come." "You were holding something when you were found," she said, without preamble. "A rubbing showing words about the princes." Redding sighed. "Yes, I made it the day before from the interior of old Gabriel. There's an inscription inside, visible only at certain angles when light hits it properly. Most of it is in Latin, but parts clearly refer to the princes and the truth of their fate." "You know more about this than you've let on, Mr. Redding," Miss Marple observed. He hesitated, then nodded slightly. "My research into medieval metallurgy wasn't merely academic. My mother's family claims descent from the Plantagenet line. I've spent years researching evidence that might clear Richard III's name." "And you believed such evidence might be found in old Gabriel?" said Professor Ainsworth impatiently. "This is established history." "Indeed," agreed Miss Marple. "But what isn't widely known is that old Gabriel was created for a specific purpose beyond calling the faithful to worship. It was designed to contain a secret, a confession from Lady Margaret Beaufort regarding the fate of the princes in the tower." A murmur ran through the small group. Miss Grantham leaned forward intently. "The traditional narrative," continued Miss Marple, "tells us that the young princes, Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York, were murdered on their uncle Richard III's orders, helping justify Henry Tudor's claim to the throne. But the hidden inscription in old Gabriel tells a different story, that the princes were alive after Richard's death, posing a threat to Tudor rule." She paused, her eyes fixing on Professor Ainsworth. "And that Margaret Beaufort herself had arranged their continued imprisonment and eventual deaths to secure her son's throne." The professor's face had gone pale, but he remained silent. "Mr. Simmons discovered references to this secret in old parish records," Miss Marple went on. "When he realized the significance of what old Gabriel might contain, he began researching further. He made rubbings of Lady Margaret's tomb, searching for clues, and eventually discovered the hidden inscription inside the bell itself, visible only at certain angles when light strikes it correctly. "This is speculation," protested the professor weakly. "Not entirely," countered Miss Marple. "You see, Mr. Simmons kept meticulous notes of his discoveries, notes that revealed how different parties responded when they learned what he had found." She turned to Miss Grantham. "You came to St. Mary Mead not as Professor Ainsworth's secretary, but because you had independently traced the historical evidence to old Gabriel. As a descendant of the Plantagenet line, you sought to expose the truth and vindicate Richard III after centuries of Tudor propaganda." Miss Grantham's expression confirmed the accuracy of Miss Marple's words. "Meanwhile," Miss Marple continued, turning back to Professor Ainsworth, "you represented not just the Trelawney Foundation, but a private collector with Tudor connections who wanted to suppress the discovery to protect the historical narrative that has prevailed for centuries." "This is absurd," spluttered the professor. "I merely sought to document a historical artifact." "No, Professor." Miss Marple's voice was suddenly steely. "You sought to silence the bell. When Mr. Simmons refused to allow private access, planning instead to make the discovery public through proper academic channels, you killed him." A gasp ran through the group. Inspector Slack leaned forward sharply. "You used a specialized bell-tuning tool, the one missing from Mr. Simmons's collection, to strike him on the head. Then you arranged his body at the base of the tower to suggest a fall. You tried to extract the evidence from within the bell, but were interrupted." "You can't prove any of this," said the professor, attempting confidence though his face had turned ashen. "Can't I?" Miss Marple reached into her handbag and withdrew a small metal tool. "This was found buried in the garden behind your lodgings at the Blue Boar, Professor. Dr. Haydock has confirmed it matches the wound pattern on Mr. Simmons's head." Inspector Slack rose to his feet, but Miss Marple hadn't finished. She turned to Mr. Redding. "You, Mr. Redding, came to St. Mary Mead specifically to investigate rumors about old Gabriel. Your background in medieval metallurgy and your family's Plantagenet connections drove your research. You discovered the hidden chamber during your own examination of the tower." Redding nodded slowly. "Yes, though I had no idea the verger had been murdered because of his discoveries. I thought his death was truly an accident." "And then you were attacked," continued Miss Marple. "Not by the professor as one might assume, but by Miss Grantham." All eyes turned to the severe woman, who didn't deny the accusation. "She believed you were working with the professor to suppress the evidence," explained Miss Marple. "A misunderstanding born of passion for historical truth, but a serious assault nonetheless." Miss Grantham's chin lifted defiantly. "I've dedicated my life to clearing Richard's name. When I saw him with the rubbing, I thought he was stealing evidence. As for the midnight ringing of old Gabriel," Miss Marple's eyes twinkled slightly, "that was my doing, with the help of Colonel Bantry, a trap to draw out our culprit, who would be concerned that the vibrations might dislodge further evidence from within the bell." Colonel Bantry nodded confirmation, a slight smile playing around his lips. "And the stolen parchment?" asked Reverend Harmon. "Was never stolen at all," replied Miss Marple. "I suggested to Mrs. Harmon that it might be safer elsewhere, given the attempts already made to suppress the evidence. She kindly agreed to secure it in a different location." She reached into her handbag once more and withdrew the sealed parchment. "I believe this document, when properly translated, will confirm the truth about the prince's fate and Margaret Beaufort's role in it. A historical secret that led to murder 5 centuries after the events it described. The British Museum will need to examine it," Inspector Slack said, carefully taking the parchment, "along with the bell itself." "Of course," agreed Miss Marple. As Inspector Slack moved to arrest Professor Ainsworth, the academic's composure finally broke. "You don't understand," he said desperately. "Some versions of history need to be preserved. The Tudor narrative is foundational to our national identity. To undermine it with this confession would be to rewrite centuries of established history." "Truth should not fear examination, Professor," Miss Marple replied quietly, "even after 500 years." In the days that followed, arrangements were made for the proper historical documentation of the discovery. Mr. Redding, once cleared of any wrongdoing, was appointed to oversee the academic publication of the findings. Mrs. Simmons found comfort in knowing her husband's work would be recognized and that his killer had been brought to justice. Miss Grantham, though charged with assaulting the curate, received a suspended sentence in light of the circumstances and her subsequent assistance to the authorities. And old Gabriel, temporarily removed for comprehensive examination, revealed its secrets at last. The hidden inscription, combined with Margaret Beaufort's sealed confession, confirmed that the princes in the tower had indeed survived Richard III's reign, only to be quietly eliminated when they posed a threat to the new Tudor dynasty, a historical revelation that would cause scholars to reassess centuries of accepted Tudor history. As life in St. Mary Mead gradually returned to normal, Miss Marple sat in her garden one summer evening, listening to the restored bells of St. Mary's ringing for evensong. Old Gabriel's deep tone, now returned to its rightful place, seemed to carry a new resonance, the resonance of truth finally spoken after centuries of silence. Colonel Bantry, joining her for tea, remarked on the peaceful sound. "Hard to believe that innocent bell caused such tragedy." "Not the bell," corrected Miss Marple, pouring him a cup of Earl Grey. "Human nature, greed, ambition, the desire to control history, these haven't changed since Tudor times." "Nor has the desire for truth," observed the Colonel. "Indeed," agreed Miss Marple with a smile. "As long as there are those who seek it, even the most carefully buried secrets cannot remain hidden forever." The bells continued their melodious chiming across the village, old Gabriel's sonorous voice now free of its ancient burden, a voice that would continue to mark the hours in St. Mary Mead, but would no longer need to guard its centuries-old secret.